How the Supreme Court is issuing orders as Trump emergencies return. Courthouse News says the justices freed Trump to enforce mail voting changes ahead of the midterms, while NPR describes the order as an interim win with hurdles still ahead. PBS adds a constitutional law explanation, which matters because the ruling is not a final merits decision. Voters, clerks, parties, and campaign lawyers now have to read an emergency order while election calendars keep moving. The immediate consequence is administrative uncertainty. Ballot deadlines, local instructions, and litigation schedules can shift before lower courts finish the record. The legal stakes are bigger than this dispute because emergency rulings can shape policy before a full opinion explains the reasoning. Supporters of the administration will point to executive authority and election integrity claims, while challengers will focus on access and late rule changes. The next concrete record is any lower court response, state election guidance, or later Supreme Court order that narrows, extends, or replaces this temporary result. County clerks will need written instructions before ballots are mailed, because informal campaign claims do not tell workers which forms or deadlines control. Lawyers on both sides will also watch whether the justices explain emergency standards or leave lower courts to infer them, especially if state officials issue conflicting instructions before the next hearing. Trump administration live updates. Canada announces 50% retaliatory tariffs as trade war escalates. Reuters reports that Ottawa is targeting about $20 billion in U.S. goods, and PBS and NPR both frame the move as Canada hitting back. The Washington Post says the measures fall on American products as the trade fight deepens. The key point is not just the percentage, but the pressure it creates across supply chains, customs paperwork, and cross-border pricing. Retaliation works by making politically visible exports more expensive, which can push business groups and regional officials to demand negotiations. Consumers may not feel every duty immediately, yet importers and manufacturers have to plan around higher landed costs and possible exemptions. The auto sector is especially sensitive because North American production often crosses borders more than once before a finished vehicle reaches a dealer. Watch for customs guidance, product lists, company warnings, and any diplomatic statement that shows whether this becomes bargaining leverage or a longer tariff cycle. Border manufacturers will monitor whether duties apply at shipment, invoice, or entry date, since that timing changes contract costs. Provincial and federal officials will also watch whether Washington exempts any category, because exemptions signal negotiating room, especially if trade lawyers publish product-level lists before negotiations restart before final invoices reach consumers and factories. Senator Darline Graham wins the Republican Senate primary runoff in South Carolina. Reuters, NBC News, NPR, Axios, and the New York Times all report the result, with the Times noting Trump's push behind Graham. That combination tells viewers the race was both a state nomination fight and a test of national Republican influence. A runoff win matters because it decides who carries the party label into the next phase, when fundraising, endorsements, and opposition research reset quickly. South Carolina Republicans now move from an intra-party contest to a general election argument over turnout, candidate discipline, and national issues. Graham's allies can claim momentum from the late vote, while defeated factions decide whether to consolidate or withhold energy. The practical records to check are certified county totals, concession statements, party unity events, and Federal Election Commission filings after the runoff. If national groups spend heavily or change reservations, that will show whether strategists see the seat as safe, newly competitive, or a vehicle for broader messaging. County certification will matter because runoff margins can influence donor confidence and whether outside groups reserve airtime early. The first unity event will also show whether losing coalitions accept Graham quickly or keep the nomination fight alive, especially if national committees use the result to steer early fall spending. Ghislaine Maxwell loses bid to throw out conviction for aiding Jeffrey Epstein. Reuters says the legal effort failed, Bloomberg identifies the conviction as sex trafficking, and USA Today reports that the judge refused to overturn the verdict. The Guardian says the court called key claims demonstrably meritless, while The Hill notes survivor concern about any path to freedom. The viewer takeaway is that an appeal is not a second trial. The defense has to show a serious legal error, not merely relitigate public controversy. That standard protects verdict finality but also keeps attention on whether trial procedure met constitutional requirements. The case remains unusually visible because Epstein's network, victim testimony, and questions about elite accountability continue to shape public trust. For survivors, each failed challenge can be both a legal closure point and another reminder of the harm described in court. Watch the docket for any further appellate petition, sentencing-related filing, or victim impact response that changes the remaining legal path. Appellate filings will matter because they reveal whether the defense is targeting jury instructions, evidence rulings, or broader trial fairness. Any survivor statement will also shape the public record around accountability beyond the technical legal decision, especially if appellate judges ask for briefing on any surviving constitutional claim in later briefs and court orders. Trump administration sends Saudi nuclear deal to Congress for review. Reuters says the proposal reached lawmakers, with the administration saying Riyadh must recognize Israel, and France 24 identifies it as a civil nuclear agreement. CNBC adds the warning from experts that proliferation risk is part of the debate. The distinction is that civilian nuclear cooperation can involve power generation, inspections, fuel rules, and technology controls, not simply a diplomatic photo opportunity. Congress reviews these arrangements because enrichment, reprocessing, and transfer terms can affect regional security for decades. Supporters may argue that a monitored pact gives Washington leverage and ties Saudi plans to normalization with Israel. Critics will focus on whether the safeguards are strong enough in a region already shaped by Iran's program and wider military competition. The next concrete records are the texts sent to Congress, committee reaction, non-proliferation assessments, and any Saudi or Israeli statement linking energy cooperation to recognition. The review clock matters because Congress can question the terms before a pact becomes settled policy. Inspectors, fuel supply rules, and limits on enrichment will determine whether the agreement is a diplomatic bridge or a proliferation liability, especially if lawmakers seek classified briefings on fuel handling, inspections, and regional security guarantees before the review clock expires, with public text available for comparison publicly. Democrat Everton Blair defeats Representative David Scott's daughter in the special election for the late congressman's seat. NBC News reports Blair's victory. CBS says the AP projected he will serve the remainder of Scott's term, and the New York Times identifies the Georgia House seat. The Hill and Fox News both emphasize that the late congressman's daughter lost the runoff bid. This matters because special elections compress the normal campaign cycle and immediately affect constituent service, committee attention, and party margins. Blair inherits a district with local expectations built during Scott's long tenure, but he also has to define his own priorities before the next election calendar arrives. For Democrats, the result answers a succession question rather than simply filling a vacancy. For voters, the practical issue is how quickly the winner opens offices, hires staff, and begins casework. Watch for certification, swearing-in timing, caucus assignments, and early statements that show whether Blair presents himself as continuity, generational change, or both. Certification matters because the House cannot fully seat a successor until the election result is formally transmitted. The first district schedule will show whether Blair prioritizes casework, federal grants, local transportation, or a national Democratic message, especially if Georgia officials publish turnout patterns showing whether the district coalition changed. Federal judge rejects Ghislaine Maxwell's miscarriage of justice claim and bid for prison release. PBS and the Los Angeles Times report the ruling, and several regional papers carried the same core account. This is separate from the broader conviction challenge because it focuses on a request for release and a claim that the continued judgment is fundamentally unfair. The court's rejection keeps the sentence in place unless a higher court, a later motion, or another procedural route changes the posture. The legal distinction matters. A dramatic phrase in a motion does not by itself meet the standard for undoing custody. Judges typically look for record-based error, changed legal authority, or evidence that would alter the reliability of the outcome. The ruling also prevents the case from moving out of the ordinary docket process simply because public attention remains intense. The next items to watch are a notice of appeal, renewed defense filings, Bureau of Prisons records if relevant, and any order explaining whether further review is available. The order also matters for prison administrators because release litigation can affect custody planning and public notice requirements. Any next filing should be read for the specific remedy requested, not only the headline phrase attached to it, especially if the defense asks a higher court to pause custody while reviewing the order. The U.S. is escalating economic pressure on Iran, meaning sanctions, retaliation risk, and diplomacy are all under strain today. Reuters frames the question around Iran's options under heavier economic threats, while the New York Times reports new economic D-Day sanctions announced by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. NBC News says Tehran vowed retaliation after Washington widened sanctions, and Al Jazeera says U.S. officials are threatening their toughest measures yet. The policy lever is financial pressure. Sanctions try to limit access to revenue, shipping, banking, and outside partners without immediately using force. The risk is that Tehran can answer economically, diplomatically, through nuclear steps, or through regional allies, each with different escalation paths. Markets and governments will watch whether exemptions, enforcement notices, or secondary penalties pull other countries into the standoff. Diplomacy becomes harder if both sides treat concessions as weakness, Yet sanctions can also be designed to force a negotiating table. Watch for Treasury designations, Iranian countermeasures, oil market signals, and statements from European, Gulf, Russian, or Chinese officials. The enforcement details matter because sanctions are only as strong as the banks, shippers, insurers, and governments that comply. Tehran's answer will show whether it treats the move as pressure to negotiate or as justification for escalation, especially if energy buyers adjust contracts before diplomats can reopen any channel through banks and oil buyers. Ukraine is targeting Russia's retail sector, with Ozon now treated as a major economic pressure point. Reuters says Kyiv is widening attacks on Russian online retailers, CNBC names Ozon as the pressure point, and The Guardian links the campaign to burn sheds involving Wildberries' rival. The Financial Times describes Ozon as Russia's second-largest online retailer, while Tech Times reports a sharp share price drop after the targeting became public. This is economic warfare aimed at consumer infrastructure rather than a battlefield position. Online retailers connect warehouses, payment systems, delivery routes, sellers, and customers, so disruption can spread beyond one company. The strategy pressures Moscow by making the war visible in daily commerce and by forcing firms to spend on security, logistics, and public reassurance. It also creates risk for civilians and workers around warehouses if physical sites are involved. Watch company statements, exchange filings, insurance disclosures, Russian official responses, and Ukrainian claims that clarify whether this is cyber pressure, physical sabotage, or a combined campaign. Investors will watch whether Ozon can keep sellers, couriers, and payment partners operating after the reported pressure. Russian consumers will notice delays or shortages faster than battlefield maps, which is why retail disruption can carry political weight, especially if warehouse damage or platform outages spread to other delivery networks during the next trading session. A year after Israeli strikes killed journalists at a hospital, no one has been held accountable. AP, The Washington Post, and NBC News all report the anniversary around the same core finding, while Al Jazeera marks 1 year since a Gaza journalist was killed by Israel. The story is about accountability as much as casualty numbers, because families, colleagues, and press freedom groups still do not have a public result that assigns responsibility. Hospitals and journalists carry special significance in conflict coverage because they are tied to civilian protection and the public's ability to know what happened. When investigations stall or remain opaque, the effect is a chilling signal to reporters working near military operations. The absence of a clear outcome also weakens confidence in military review systems and international pressure mechanisms. Viewers should separate verified deaths, claims about intent, and the narrower question of whether any official process produced consequences. Watch for investigative releases, court petitions, press group findings, government responses, and any named disciplinary or criminal action. The evidence record matters because accountability depends on names, chain of command, targeting decisions, and review findings. Newsrooms in Gaza will also watch whether the anniversary brings protection commitments or only another cycle of statements, especially if independent investigators publish new timelines, video analysis, or witness accounts.